Hello, everyone. Welcome to your anatomy lecture for today. Today, we are going to be taking a look at the blood vessels of the upper extremity, which will include the arteries and veins that go up and down from the arm to the forearm to the hand and back. So, before we take a look at anything specific, let's actually talk a little bit about the organization of blood vessels first. So, number one, we have the heart, and the heart is found right in the middle of the thorax, right between the sternum, or right behind the sternum, between the lungs, and that is where basically everything kind of goes in and out from. And depending on which side of this whole system we're talking about, it can either be picking up oxygen or delivering oxygen, but also bring that blood back as well. So, just to be clear, the heart has four chambers, two atria and two ventricles. The atria are going to be receiving blood, and the ventricles will be pumping the blood out. But depending on which side, that blood is going to be oxygenated or deoxygenated and related to two different circulatory systems. So you have either the systemic or pulmonary circulatory systems. The pulmonary is the one where you get oxygen and then bring it back to the heart. The systemic is where you deliver the oxygen and then bring deoxygenated blood back. So if you look closely, you have two sides to this, and you can see the right side, which is right atrium and right ventricle. This is going to have deoxygenated blood, and this blood will come back from the body with no oxygen or very little and return to the right atrium. From the right atrium, it'll go down into the right ventricle and then out to the lungs. And then this is where you can see that blood starting to turn from blue to red. And just to be clear, not literally and physically blue to red, but at least what we will conceptualize as going from deoxygenated to oxygenated blood. Now that oxygenated blood now returns back to the left atrium. It goes down to the left ventricle, and now the left ventricle, which, if you know anything about the heart, is actually the bigger side between the two, and the left ventricle is going to be pumping the blood out to the body. Now, when I say body, I mean like everywhere except for the lungs. So it'll go to the head, the brain, the upper extremity, the lower extremity, and then everything in between, including the digestive system, the renal system, the reproductive system, everything except for the lungs. So the blood vessels that we will be looking at are the ones that go into the upper extremity today. But one last thing to talk about regarding like the organization of this whole system is that it's going to be largely divided between arteries and veins. So arteries, just to be clear, those are the ones that are going to be coming out or bring blood out of the heart to the body. So this is going to help with delivering oxygenated blood. So these are going to be going away from the heart, while veins, in this case for systemic, will be going back to the heart with deoxygenated blood. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and keep on going, where you can see that, once again, not literally red and blue, but red and blue is going to be indicating oxygenated versus deoxygenated blood. The red blood vessels are going to be oxygenated while the blue blood vessels are deoxygenated. And roughly, while we're not talking about stuff going to the lungs, red is arteries, blue is veins. So when we get to the lungs, there will be, an exception to this rule. But in this case, all of these red ones are arteries, all of these blue ones are veins. And we're going to be looking at these arteries and veins that go up and down the upper extremity, which will be supplying this body part with blood. So to get started, let's take a look at the arteries of the upper extremity, which will start very close to the heart at the subclavian artery, and then it'll go outwards into the armpit at the axillary artery, go down to the brachial artery, where there'll be like different branches, including the profunda brachii artery, as well as ones that go into the forearm called radial and ulnar, and then finally into the hand as superficial and deep palmar arteries, or later, or eventually, to the arch. So to get started, let's look at what we've got here, basically at the heart. So this is the heart, and then you can see this large artery called the aorta. And then there's three things coming off the aorta, which is going to make things a little tricky because there's some asymmetry between the two, or between the left and right sides. On the left side over here, this is where we have something called the left subclavian artery. So the left subclavian artery directly comes off of the aorta, and the subclavian artery means that this is under the clavicle, subclavian, kind of subclavicle. So subclavian is going to go, oh, sorry, I'm wrong side. The left subclavian artery comes off of the aorta and then goes out to the upper extremity. And you do have a right side as well, but in this case, the right side comes off of something else called the brachiocephalic trunk. So in fact, that is actually not shown here, but instead of coming off the aorta directly, the right subclavian artery comes off of something called the brachiocephalic trunk. And the brachiocephalic trunk, so if you know what the words brachio and cephalic mean, brachio means arm, cephalic means head. So this is going to supply the blood going to the head and arm, and the one that we are interested in is the right subclavian artery. So right subclavian artery comes off of brachiocephalic trunk, left subclavian artery comes off of the aorta directly, or rather the aortic arch. But please just be aware of like the differences between left and right sides because there is some differences or asymmetry between them. So subclavian artery is going to actually have a few different parts to them, specifically the first, the second, and the third part, which is going to be relative to a muscle called the anterior scalene. So whether it's before or kind of under or directly afterwards, you have the first, the second, and the third part. So the first part, this is where we're going to see a couple of arteries. So it's a little bit small, but if you look closely, there's a small artery that's going to be coming off first, coming off the subclavian artery. This is called the vertebral artery. So vertebral, I know we haven't really talked about that word yet, but vertebral is referring to the vertebra. So this blood vessel is actually going to go up and along the sides of the vertebra, up to the brain through the foramen magnum. So this is going to go up through the transverse foramen of the cervical vertebrae, up through the foramen magnum, and then form the basilar artery to go to something called the circle of Willis. So vertebral artery is going to be going upward. So I know we're a little bit off from where we're supposed to be going, but vertebral artery is coming off of the first branch or the first part of the subclavian artery. But then you also have something called the internal thoracic artery. And the internal thoracic artery is something that we briefly talked about, but this is going to help with supplying blood to your sternoclavicular joint, but also your sternum. So, or your sternum and your ribs. So this is actually going to run behind the sternum, right along the sides of the back side or posterior side of the sternum. And then there will have various branches that come off of it called anterior intercostal arteries. So let's just stop at internal thoracic artery, probably went a little too far. So vertebral artery and internal thoracic artery are coming off of the first part, but then also something called the thyrocervical trunk. So thyrocervical. I know it doesn't get a lot of attention, but the thyroid gland is pretty important, and thyrocervical is going to be going to structures of the, or is going to be going to structures of the neck and the head. Or sorry, neck and the thyroid. But there is one artery that we are interested in that comes off of the thyrocervical trunk, and that's something that hopefully is pretty familiar called the suprascapular artery. So suprascapular artery comes off the thyrocervical trunk, and then it's going to go over the suprascapular notch, or sorry, suprascapular ligament, and then it's going to go along like the top of the scapula. Now the second branch, this is also going to have something that's, or this is also going to have a branch that comes off of it called the costocervical trunk. And I don't think I saw this very clearly on here, but the costocervical trunk should be coming off right in the middle over here. But costocervical means rib and neck. But lastly, the third part does have something that we want to look for, which unfortunately you don't really see very well over here because it would be coming off and going a little bit posteriorly. But this right here, where you can see the back of the scapula, this is where you can see the dorsal scapular artery, which unfortunately is not actually attached to the subclavian on the picture, but dorsal scapular, just like the nerve, is going to be going along the levator scapulae, the rhomboids, and then along the back, kind of medial to the scapula. So the subclavian artery, believe it or not, does have some specificity to it. So at the very least, I would definitely try to be aware of the ones that we have looked at, such as dorsal scapular artery, but internal thoracic artery is another one that we looked at, as well as suprascapular artery. Now, when we look at the subclavian artery, it's actually going to have a name change. So to go back just ever so briefly, the subclavian artery, if you look closely, doesn't necessarily change its course that much. Like something that you see regarding arteries is that typically when you look for an artery and where it changes or where it terminates, it typically branches. So in this case, it's actually not going to do that. Although we usually look for that, it's not going to do that here. It's actually going to change names as it goes into a new region, or more specifically, past a certain landmark. So when subclavian artery passes the first rib right along that lateral edge, this is where it starts to turn into the axillary artery. So the axillary artery is going to start at the first rib, right after the clavicle, but then it's going to go downwards through the armpit, because that's what axillary means. But once again, kind of like before, there's a landmark that helps you to know where axillary artery ends, and that's specifically a muscle called teres major. So teres major, although not visible, is going to be right at the bottom of the armpit, right along with the latissimus dorsi, and that's where the axillary artery will then turn into another artery in the arm region, which, if we know what the word for arm, the brachial artery. But kind of like subclavian artery, axillary artery has some regions too, and axillary arteries regions will actually be relative to the pectoralis minor. So if it's before the pectoralis minor, or if it's under the pectoralis minor, or lastly after pectoralis minor, there are the three parts. So the first part, the region before the pectoralis minor, this is a little tough, but if you look closely, right, you have the axillary artery here, and you have these three parts. And this picture is a little bit odd because it should actually show the pectoralis minor on top of axillary artery, but here would be axillary artery right here. And the first part, this is going to be before pectoralis minor, and this is where you can see an artery called superior thoracic artery. So superior thoracic artery comes off of the first part of the axillary artery, but then you also have the second part of the axillary artery, which is where you're going to have the thoracoacromial artery, which acromial means the acromion, or refers to the acromion, but thoracoacromial, you can see right over here, coming off and going towards the acromion. And then lateral thoracic artery, although not labeled, unfortunately, you can see that here. You can see it coming off on the medial side and going towards the thorax. So this is going to run along the lateral thorax, but it comes off of the axillary artery on the medial side. Now, lastly, ones that we're probably more familiar with and more interested in, we have three more arteries that come off of the third part of the axillary artery. So once again, looking closely, pectoralis minor, this is the third part, but this is where you'll see three arteries coming off. So if you look closely over here, you can see the humerus, and the neck of the humerus is surrounded by a couple of arteries, one on the front, one on the back. These are going to be the anterior and posterior circumflex humeral arteries. So this should sound familiar from lab specifically, because we talked about the posterior circumflex humeral artery, which travels along with the axillary nerve. But you can also see the anterior circumflex humeral artery coming off the front, and both of these come off in a similar region, but one goes to the front, one goes to the back. But also, one last thing that kind of differentiates them is that the posterior is typically bigger. So posterior circumflex humeral artery, anterior circumflex humeral artery, but lastly, there's another one that comes off of the medial side of the third part of axillary artery, and that is the subscapular artery. So subscapular artery, that's going to be going under the clavicle, basically to where exactly where it sounds. So it's going to go under the clavicle between itself and the thorax. So the axillary artery has some specific parts as well, but remember these parts are relative to the pectoralis minor. So try to break it down based off of where that you find them, but then also at the very least we do see some of these when we look at the cadavers, so try to take note of those as well. Now from here, we're going to see that we can kind of divide the arteries a little bit based off of what compartments they go to. So you have the anterior compartment and the posterior compartment, and largely, I guess they're slightly differentiated between their anterior and posterior, but also some that are a little more superficial and a little bit deeper. So once again, when the axillary artery continues downward, it will start to travel into the arm region, but specifically as it passes a certain muscle, as it passes the teres major, it's going to then start to form the brachial artery. So it doesn't necessarily branch and divide and form like, two new arteries. It just continues down and goes into a new region, and this is the brachial artery. So the brachial artery is going to continue down from the axillary artery, and then it's going to continue down into the forearm, where it will then furthermore divide into the radial and ulnar. So finally, you'll have a termination where it branches into the forearm as radial and ulnar. So to take a look at brachial artery, there are actually some specific branches that we want to look for, and at the very least, one of which we'll be able to see on the cadaver. So first of all, you can see brachial artery here. Brachial artery is going down. It's going to go all the way down to the forearm, but there's a few things that you want to take note of. Number one, something that we were able to see in the lab, the profunda brachii artery. So the word profunda means deep. So this is actually going to go deep into the arm, specifically into the back of the arm, directly under the triceps brachii. So profunda brachii artery, you can see right here. This is going to go behind the humerus, and you can see that indicated by a slightly lighter color. This is the profunda brachii artery running behind the humerus and spiraling around the humerus a little bit with a certain nerve. So if you remember what groove is in the back of the humerus, remember what nerve is in the back of the humerus, that's going to be the radial nerve. So profunda brachii artery runs with the radial nerve in the back of the humerus, and while the brachial artery continues down to the front of the elbow. But although we'll look at these in the next slides, if you look closely, there will be a couple of arteries called collateral arteries, either the superior ulnar collateral artery or the inferior ulnar collateral artery. And what collateral basically means is that it's kind of going to go to a place where there's going to be some shared blood flow, I guess. So it's going to form something called anastomoses, but I'll talk about that when we get to it. So if you look closely, well, I guess we're getting to it now, but if you look closely, we have the profunda brachii artery, which is all the way in the back of the humerus here. But the profunda brachii artery, as we were talking about, spirals around the back of the humerus very deeply, which is what profunda is indicating, directly under the triceps brachii and with the radial nerve. But profunda brachii artery has a couple of branches as well, which includes the medial and radial, or sorry, not medial, middle and radial collateral arteries. So middle collateral artery is going to be, oh no, no. Middle collateral artery is going to be running along the back of the humerus, down the middle, right over here. And it's going to be connecting to something called the interosseous recurrent artery. So I know that this is a little bit of a weird thing, but this is what I was actually referring to. So a lot of these collateral arteries are going to be kind of joining with another artery. And we form something called anastomosis, which is where these arteries kind of connect. And it's a little bit weird, but this is going to lead to capillaries in a certain region. And having two blood supplies to this region is actually kind of helpful because dependent on whether one body part is going to have more pressure put onto it, whether one body part is just going to be damaged, or one body part has, or one kind of source of blood is a little bit more compromised, one of them is going to be able to hopefully be able to provide this body part with blood. So let's just say that the middle collateral artery happened to have some pressure put onto it. The interosseous artery is going to be able to provide blood instead. So middle collateral artery, this is going to be able to connect to the interosseous artery, which you can see down here, right down there. But you also have the radial collateral artery, which comes off, and radial is referring to the radius, which is the bone on the lateral side of the forearm. So you have two bones in the forearm, the radius on the lateral side, on the thumb side, and then the ulna on the pinky side, the medial side. So radial collateral artery comes off of the profunda brachii artery. It goes along the lateral side of the elbow, and luckily it connects to the radial collateral artery, the radial recurrent artery. So you have a radial collateral artery, which is bringing blood down, and then a radial recurrent artery, which brings blood back. And they both kind of go to the elbow region so that they can supply that part with blood. And if one of them gets compromised or put pressure on, one of them will be able to finish the job. So I guess I should have talked about them a little bit more over here. If you look closely, the brachial artery has two more arteries that came off of them: superior ulnar artery, or superior ulnar collateral artery, and inferior ulnar collateral artery. And ulnar, as we were just saying, is on the medial side. So on the medial side, that's where you're going to find two arteries, the superior one and the inferior one coming off. And these collateral arteries are going to be connecting to recurrent arteries, just like before. So in fact, there's a chart over here which helps you to kind of understand that. So radial collateral artery connects to radial recurrent artery. Middle collateral artery connects to interosseous recurrent artery, which is the ones we just talked about. But the superior and inferior ulnar collateral arteries connect to a couple of ulnar recurrent arteries. So posterior ulnar recurrent artery connects to the superior collateral, and then anterior ulnar recurrent artery connects to inferior collateral. So I know this is a little bit weird. I don't know. I hope you would have wished that we could have just been like superior and superior or something, but when they come back from the recurrent regions, they're not exactly the same. As in, like, it's not like, superior and inferior down here. It's posterior and anterior. So unfortunately, the names kind of change, but I do have just a kind of small thing that I have used to kind of remember this, which is that the two that start with consonants, superior and posterior, those are the ones that connect. And then the two that start with vowels, inferior and anterior, are the ones that connect. But it's still the same pattern between collateral and recurrent. There's a collateral or ulnar collateral artery that connects to an ulnar recurrent artery, and the same thing, just superior and posterior, inferior and anterior. So, one more thing I can talk about just very briefly about the posterior ulnar recurrent artery is that there is actually a part that comes out a little bit near the elbow, specifically along the medial epicondyle, just like the ulnar nerve. Now, going down to the forearm, if you follow along, the brachial artery is going to go down, and then although it had a bunch of branches coming off, it actually ends when it branches out to two major arteries, which are the radial and ulnar arteries. So the radial and ulnar arteries are going to be traveling down, and to start off with, the radial artery. This is going to be going down the lateral side, which is where you find the radius, and it's going to terminate and then kind of branch out even further when you get near the end or the anatomical snuff box. So this artery, though, is actually the artery that you feel when you take your pulse. So if you take your pulse, you can bring your hand out, and then on the radial side, on the lateral side of your forearm, feel for the front of the radius first, or sorry, the side of the radius, and then go slightly anterior to it. And right there, hopefully, you should be feeling your pulse. So the branches of the radial artery, we actually talked about one of them already. Radial recurrent artery is the one that connects to the radial collateral artery. So you can see that coming off and going up and connecting to it on the lateral side of the elbow. But there will actually be very similar branches that come off the radial and ulnar arteries, and those are going to be palmar or dorsal carpal branches of the arteries. So these are going to be coming off and going either kind of to the front or the back or front and deep parts of the hand. So that's not exactly very visible, but you'll have ones that go to the palm, and then you'll have ones that go to the back or specifically a little bit deeper into the hand as well. So the other major branch of the brachial artery is called the ulnar artery. And the ulnar artery is going to be found on the medial side, which is along the ulna. So the ulnar artery is actually pretty visible when we look at the forearm, and we'll look at it specifically underneath a muscle called the flexor carpi ulnaris. So the flexor carpi ulnaris will be a pretty superficial muscle that we can look under pretty easily. And right under there, we should find the ulnar artery as well as the ulnar nerve. So ulnar artery and ulnar nerve should be basically right next to each other. So in fact, they actually can be a little bit confusing between the two, but one of them should be flatter, the nerve. One of them should be rounder and more tubular, the artery. Now the ulnar artery has some, branches as well, and we talked about a couple of these already. So you have the anterior and posterior ulnar recurrent artery. And remember, anterior, this is going to be connecting to the other bowel one, inferior ulnar collateral artery. And then the posterior ulnar recurrent artery connects to the superior ulnar collateral artery. So the two vowels connect, anterior and inferior, and then the two consonants connect, posterior and superior. So I know it's kind of dumb, but I mean, that's just the way that I remember it. So hopefully it can help you too. But there's also an artery that's going to be coming off and going kind of along the interosseous membrane. And the first part of this is called common interosseous artery. Now, this is kind of our first time hearing the word common, I believe. But when you hear the word common, it's typically going to indicate that there's going to be more of this kind. And in this case, the common interosseous artery will branch to anterior and posterior interosseous artery. So although not super visible, well, actually pretty visible, you can see the common interosseous artery coming off the ulnar artery here. And then you have two arteries, one that runs behind and becomes a little opaque, the posterior interosseous artery. And then you also have the anterior interosseous artery, which is going to be on the anterior side of the interosseous membrane. And in this case, they're very deep, as in like they're basically in the center of the forearm. So these are going to be very deep and kind of hard to see. But lastly, you have the recurrent interosseous artery, which is going to be coming off of the common interosseous artery as well. And then it's going to be going back up to connect to the middle collateral artery. So you'll see that these arteries kind of go along the compartments to some extent as well. So the anterior compartment will have branches from the ulnar artery, the anterior interosseous artery, which is on the front of the interosseous membrane, and then the anterior and posterior ulnar recurrent arteries, which will be coming off of the ulnar artery as well. But then distally, you'll have the palmar carpal artery, which will be going to the palmar carpal network in the front of the hand. Now, the posterior compartment will include a few arteries as well, which the counterpart to the anterior interosseous artery will be the posterior interosseous artery, but then also the recurrent interosseous artery. And then the counterpart to palmar, you have dorsal carpal network. So the hand, kind of like the elbow, is going to have a bunch of different arteries joining or anastomosing together. Because when you move your hand and when you move your wrist, certain arteries will be kind of compressed and certain arteries will not. And hopefully, at least one of them will be able to provide the hand with sufficient amount of blood. So you have supplies from both the radial and ulnar arteries, which will actually be connecting to each other along these two different arches, the palmar and the dorsal arch. So you have two arches here. And I guess to start off with, we have these branches. So you have the deep palmar branch and the superficial palmar branch. These are going to be coming off of the ulnar artery over here before they get to those arches. So you have the superficial and the deep arch, which will be two arches, two kind of curved regions that connect to like the sides of the radius and the ulnar, or the radial and ulnar arteries. But the deep palmar branch is going to go deeper in the hand, and the superficial palmar branch will go more superficially. So when you talk about the palm, it's the front of the hand. One of them will be more superficial along the surface, and then one of them will be slightly deeper, more central. So like I was saying though, these will anastomose with other arteries, specifically coming from the radial artery. So you'll have the deep palmar branch, which goes to the deep palmar arch, and the superficial palmar branch, which goes to the superficial palmar arch. Now, with that in mind, let's take a look at the veins, which the veins are going to be not too bad, but it's a little tricky. But let's go ahead and talk about the veins in the next video. So I'll go over the veins as well as go over a blood flow chart to kind of talk about how to follow the blood flow, because following veins is a little bit trickier than following arteries, which has a lot, well, arteries kind of like goes out and gets smaller. Veins, you actually have to start off at the small ones and then join together to get bigger. So with that said, I'll be finishing the lecture in the next video with the veins, as well as going over a couple of blood flow pathways for you as well. So thanks for listening. Good luck with your studying, and I'll see you all next time.